The email from my dad landed in my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a lecture on macroeconomic theory that I'd been half listening to while taking notes more out of habit than actual engagement. I remember the professor was mid-sentence about elasticity curves when my phone buzzed against the wooden desk, the vibration loud enough that the girl next to me glanced over briefly before returning her attention to her own notes. I almost didn't check it right away, but something about the timing, a Tuesday afternoon, not a typical time for my father to reach out about anything, made me glance down instinctively. The subject line alone was enough to make my stomach tighten slightly before I'd even opened it. Regarding tuition, please read carefully. My father had never been a particularly warm communicator, but even by his standards, that subject line felt clinical in a way that put me on edge before I'd absorbed a single word of the actual message. I opened it under the desk, phone angled away from my neighbor's view, and read through it as quietly as I could manage while my pulse started climbing. Given the costs of your sister's wedding, we've decided to redirect the funds previously allocated toward your remaining tuition. We trust you understand the priorities here. We'll revisit your education next year. That was it. No preamble, no acknowledgement of the fact that I had 2 semesters left before graduation, no mention of what exactly I was supposed to do in the meantime to cover a tuition bill that ran well into 5 figures. Just a flat, procedural announcement, as though he were informing me of a change to a subscription service rather than pulling the financial rug out from beneath my education with less than a semester's notice. I read the email twice, then a third time, waiting for some detail to reveal itself that would make the whole thing make more sense, some context I was missing that would soften the blow, or explain the reasoning more thoroughly. But there was nothing else there. Just those 3 sentences, sitting in my inbox with the same weight as an eviction notice, delivered with the same emotional detachment my father brought to everything from tax season to holiday planning. I sat there in that lecture hall for another 10 minutes, unable to focus on anything the professor was saying, my mind spinning through calculations and half-formed questions I didn't yet have answers to. Eventually, I couldn't sit still any longer, and I gathered my things quietly, murmuring an apology to the classmate beside me as I slipped past her toward the aisle, stepping out into the hallway where the fluorescent lights felt suddenly too bright and the ambient noise of students moving between classes felt distant and irrelevant compared to the storm building in my chest. I called my mother first, mostly out of habit, since she was usually the more reasonable of my 2 parents, the one who occasionally softened my father's more rigid decisions when she felt they'd gone too far. She answered on the 4th ring, and I could tell immediately from the tightness in her voice that this wasn't going to be the conversation I was hoping for. "Hello," she said, and there was already a defensive edge underneath the greeting, as though she'd been expecting this call and had spent the intervening time bracing herself for it. "Mom, I just got Dad's email," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tightness building in my throat. "About the tuition. Is this real? Are you guys actually pulling my funding with 2 semesters left?" "Your father sent that email, not me," she said, which struck me immediately as a strange thing to lead with, as though the specific sender mattered more than the substance of the message itself. "But he's right, honey. Michelle's wedding is costing significantly more than we originally budgeted for, and we simply don't have the funds to cover everything at once. The venue alone ended up costing almost double what we initially planned, and then there's the catering, the flowers, the band she wants instead of just a DJ. It's a lot all at once, and something had to give." "So the thing that gave was my education," I said, and I could hear my own voice starting to shake slightly, though whether from anger or disbelief I honestly couldn't tell in that moment. "You've paid for my tuition since freshman year, Mom. Every semester, without question, and now, with 2 semesters left before I graduate, you're telling me the money's going toward Michelle's ice sculpture instead?" "Don't be dramatic," she said, though there was something brittle underneath her tone that told me even she recognized how badly this decision was going to land, how difficult it was going to be to justify. "Your sister only gets married once. We want to do this properly for her, give her the wedding she's always dreamed about. You're smart, you're resourceful, you'll figure out the last 2 semesters somehow. Maybe loans, maybe a payment plan with the school." I wanted to ask her what exactly resourceful was supposed to mean in this context, whether she expected me to simply manifest $22,000 out of sheer willpower and good intentions, but I could already tell from the rhythm of the conversation that pushing harder wasn't going to change anything. This decision had clearly already been finalized somewhere behind closed doors, discussed and settled without any input from me, in the same quiet, definitive way so many decisions in my family seemed to get made, always somehow benefiting Michelle most in the end. "Did you even consider asking me before making this decision?" I asked, quieter now, some of the initial shock giving way to something heavier and more exhausted. "Not even a conversation about it beforehand? Just an email telling me it's already decided." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought maybe she was going to offer something resembling an actual apology, some acknowledgement that this had been handled poorly. Instead, she simply sighed, the particular sigh she always used when she wanted a conversation to be over. "We didn't think it would be this big a deal," she said. "You're always so independent about everything. We figured you'd handle it fine. Look, I have to go. We've got a meeting with the caterer in 20 minutes. We'll talk more this weekend, okay? Love you." The call ended before I could say anything else, before I could push further into the dozen questions crowding my mind. How long this had been discussed, who had actually made the final call, whether my father had even considered how disruptive this would be to my final year, or whether I'd simply been an afterthought in a much larger conversation about flower arrangements and open bars. I stood there in the hallway for a long moment after the call ended, phone still in my hand, staring blankly at the wall across from me while students moved past in both directions, oblivious to the quiet demolition that had just occurred in the middle of their ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I thought about calling Michelle directly, asking her if she even knew, if she had any idea that her wedding budget was being funded partially by yanking my tuition out from under me with barely any warning. But some tired, familiar instinct told me exactly how that conversation would go. She'd likely act surprised, maybe even sympathetic in that surface-level way she always managed, before ultimately shrugging it off as something between me and our parents, nothing she felt any real responsibility to get involved in, despite being the direct beneficiary of the decision. I didn't call her. I didn't respond to my father's email either, not that day, not that week. Instead, I walked back into the lecture hall, slid back into my seat, and spent the remainder of class staring blankly at my notebook, the professor's voice fading into background noise while my mind ran through calculations that had nothing to do with economics and everything to do with survival, resentment, and a growing, deliberate resolve that I couldn't yet fully name, but that I could feel taking root somewhere deep and cold beneath the initial shock. That evening, I sat at the small desk in my apartment for a long time before I even opened my laptop, staring at the closed lid as though it contained something I wasn't quite ready to confront. I'd gone through the motions of the rest of my day mechanically, finished my classes, picked up a sandwich I barely tasted, nodded along to a roommate's story about her internship without really absorbing a word of it, all while that email sat in the back of my mind like a low, persistent hum I couldn't quite shut off. By the time I finally sat down and opened my laptop around 9 that night, I felt strangely calm, the earlier panic having settled into something quieter and more focused. I pulled up my business accounts first, the ones connected to the consulting work I'd been doing for the past year and a half, work that had started almost by accident during my junior year when a professor had connected me with a local distribution company struggling to untangle a mess of inefficient shipping routes. What began as a single-class project turned paid contract had slowly, steadily grown into something much larger than I'd ever anticipated, words spreading through referrals until I found myself managing ongoing consulting relationships with 4 different companies, optimizing everything from warehouse layouts to delivery scheduling, charging rates that had climbed considerably as my reputation solidified within that small but lucrative niche. I hadn't looked closely at the full financial picture in months, mostly because the day-to-day rhythm of client calls and project deadlines didn't leave much room for reflective bookkeeping, and partly, if I'm honest with myself, because some part of me had been avoiding it, uncertain how I'd feel once I saw the actual numbers laid out plainly in front of me. That night, though, I forced myself to sit with it, opening spreadsheet after spreadsheet, tallying invoices and payments across the past 12 months until a final figure emerged that made me sit back slightly in my chair. $193,000. That was what I'd earned over the past year, most of it still sitting untouched in savings and a modest investment account, since I'd been living the frugal lifestyle of a full-time student throughout, never having much reason or opportunity to spend it on anything beyond rent, groceries, and the occasional night out with friends. I stared at that number for a long time, feeling something strange settle over me. Not quite pride, not quite anger, but some complicated mixture of both, tangled together with a specific, disorienting realization that I had quietly built something substantial while my parents had spent years treating my education as a favor they were graciously extending to me. I thought, almost involuntarily, about my father's salary, a number I knew only because he'd mentioned it once at a family dinner years earlier, during one of his rare moments of vulnerability, lamenting a promotion he'd been passed over for despite over 2 decades of loyal service at the same accounting firm. $152,000 annually, he'd said, his voice carrying that particular blend of pride and quiet resentment that always accompanied conversations about his career, as though the number represented both an achievement and a ceiling he'd never quite been able to break through no matter how hard he worked. I sat there doing the math slowly, deliberately, letting the comparison sink in fully rather than rushing past it. I had already, quietly and without any fanfare, surpassed the financial benchmark my father had spent his entire adult life working toward, the number he referenced with such careful pride at family gatherings, the number that had apparently justified decades of long hours and missed dinners, and the specific brand of exhaustion that had defined so much of my childhood memories of him. And yet here he was, informing me via a 3-sentence email that my education wasn't worth funding because Michelle wanted a live band instead of a DJ. The irony of it felt almost dizzying, sharp enough that I actually laughed out loud once, alone in my apartment, a short, disbelieving sound that startled even me in the quiet of the room. I thought about all the years I'd spent quietly building this business in the background, never mentioning the specific figures to my parents beyond vague, deflecting answers whenever they asked how the little side project was going, always downplaying it instinctively, some part of me sensing early on that revealing exactly how well things were going might complicate the family dynamic in ways I wasn't prepared to navigate. I told myself it was modesty or privacy, or simply not wanting to make a big deal out of something still finding its footing. But sitting there that night, I recognized something else underneath those explanations, something closer to self-protection, an instinct that had apparently been right all along, given how quickly and casually my education had just been sacrificed for Michelle's benefit the moment my parents assumed I had no other options. I didn't respond to my father's email that night. I closed the laptop instead, sat back in my chair, and let the silence of the apartment settle around me while I turned the entire situation over slowly in my mind, examining it from every angle I could think of. Some part of me wanted to fire back an immediate, furious reply, laying out exactly how unfair this decision was, how disposable it made me feel compared to Michelle, how 22 years of being the reliable, low-maintenance daughter had apparently earned me nothing more than an afterthought status the moment real money got tight. But another part of me, quieter and more calculating, recognized that an emotional response would accomplish very little beyond giving my parents the satisfaction of seeing exactly how much this had rattled me. Instead, I decided to wait. I let the days pass without responding, watching as my father's email sat unanswered in my inbox, watching as no follow-up message arrived asking why I hadn't replied, which told me almost everything I needed to know about how little urgency they actually felt about the situation. If they'd genuinely worried about my reaction, about the practical fallout of pulling my tuition with 2 semesters remaining, surely someone would have reached out again within a few days to check in. Nobody did. The silence from their end matched my own, except theirs seemed to stem from indifference, while mine had begun to feel more like preparation. That weekend, true to her word, my mother called, her voice light and breezy in a way that suggested she'd already mentally filed the tuition conversation under resolved, despite nothing actually having been resolved at all. "How's everything going, sweetie?" she asked, launching almost immediately into an update about wedding planning, about the caterer finally confirming the menu, about Michelle's dress fitting scheduled for the following week, an entire conversation built around the assumption that the earlier conversation about my tuition had simply been absorbed and accepted, filed away as a minor bump rather than the seismic shift it actually represented. I let her talk for a while, offering minimal responses, before finally steering the conversation back to where I needed it to go. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her, keeping my voice deliberately calm and measured. "About being resourceful. I think I have some ideas for how to handle the tuition situation." "Oh, that's wonderful," she said, relief evident in her voice, clearly relieved that this particular thread of conflict seemed to be resolving itself without further confrontation. "I knew you'd figure something out. You've always been so capable." "I have some things to sort through first," I said. "But I think everything's going to work out fine." Better than fine, actually. There was a small pause on her end, something in my tone perhaps registering as slightly different than she expected, though she didn't press further. "Well, that's good to hear," she said, already shifting the conversation back toward wedding details, toward seating charts and the specific shade of blue Michelle wanted for the bridesmaid dresses, entirely unaware that on my end of the phone, I wasn't thinking about seating charts at all. I was thinking about exactly how, and when I wanted to reveal the full picture of what I'd built, the numbers I'd been quietly sitting on, and the specific, deliberate way I intended to make sure my parents finally understood who they'd actually been dismissing so easily. I let 3 more weeks pass before I decided the moment was right, using that time deliberately rather than idly. I met with an accountant a friend had recommended, someone experienced with small business finances, and had him help me put together a clean, professional summary of my consulting business, revenue over the past 18 months, current contracts, projected earnings for the coming year. I wasn't entirely sure why I felt the need to formalize it that way, except that some part of me wanted the numbers presented with enough polish and legitimacy that there would be no room left for my parents to dismiss it as some inflated exaggeration or a lucky fluke. I also used the time to sort out my tuition directly with the university's financial aid office, discovering that I qualified for a manageable short-term loan to cover the gap for my final 2 semesters, one I could pay off within months given my actual income. That mattered to me, quietly, more than I expected it to. The fact that I didn't actually need my parents' money at all, that the entire crisis they created had a solution sitting right in front of me the whole time, one that didn't require their permission or their guilt. I chose Sunday dinner as the moment, mostly because it was the one weekly gathering where both my parents and Michelle would reliably be in the same room, sitting around the same table where so many family decisions had quietly been made and unmade over the years without my input. I arrived that evening with a manila folder tucked under my arm, and I remember my mother glancing at it briefly as I set it on the counter, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face before she turned back to finishing the pasta she was plating. Dinner proceeded normally at first, conversation dominated almost entirely by wedding details, as it had been for months at that point, Michelle recounting some minor drama with her maid of honor, my father nodding along with a particular attentiveness he reserved almost exclusively for anything involving his older daughter. I sat through it quietly, eating without much appetite, waiting for a natural pause in the conversation before I finally spoke up. "I wanted to update everyone on the tuition situation," I said, and the table went quiet almost immediately, my mother's fork pausing halfway to her mouth, my father's eyes flicking toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I've actually got it handled. I took out a short-term loan through the school to cover the remaining 2 semesters. See," my mother said, relief evident in her voice, already reaching for her wine glass as though the entire conversation could be closed out with that single sentence. "I knew you'd figure it out. You've always been so resourceful." I wanted to explain a bit more about why I was able to handle it so easily, though. I continued, and something in my tone must have registered differently than my previous, quieter conversations about it, because my father set down his own fork and gave me his full attention for the first time. "I've been running a consulting business for the past year and a half, helping companies with supply chain logistics. It started as a class project, but it's grown into something fairly substantial." I opened the folder then, sliding copies of the summary across the table toward my parents, watching as my father picked his up first, adjusting his reading glasses before scanning the page. I watched his expression shift slowly as his eyes moved down the document, from mild curiosity to something more careful, more focused, the particular look he got when he was reviewing numbers professionally rather than casually. "This says you earned almost $200,000 last year," he said, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in a long time, none of the flat, procedural detachment from his email present in the room now. "193,000, to be exact," I said. This year's projected to be higher, based on the contracts I've already got locked in. The table fell into a silence unlike any I'd experienced at that dinner table before, Michelle glancing between me and our parents with an expression that looked almost like she was trying to figure out whether this was some kind of joke. My mother had gone very still, her wine glass forgotten in her hand, and I could see her doing quiet mental math. The same calculation I imagined was running through my father's mind as he continued studying the page in front of him. "I don't understand," my father said finally, setting the paper down slowly. "Why wouldn't you tell us this? We've been paying your tuition for years, and this whole time you've had—" He stopped himself, seeming to search for the right words. "You've had this kind of income, and you never said anything?" "Would it have mattered?" I asked, and I could hear an edge creeping into my own voice now, the careful calm I'd maintained through most of the conversation beginning to fray slightly. "You made the decision to pull my tuition without asking me a single question about my situation. You assumed I'd figure it out somehow, and you were right, but not because I'm simply resourceful in some vague, abstract way. I'm making more money right now than you are, Dad. I have been for a while." I watched something shift across his face at that, a complicated mixture of surprise and what looked almost like wounded pride, the specific expression of a man confronting the fact that a number he'd spent 2 decades working toward, a number he referenced with careful pride at family gatherings, had quietly been surpassed by his 22-year-old daughter, without his knowledge. "That's not," he started, then stopped again, clearly struggling to find footing in a conversation that had shifted entirely outside the parameters he'd expected walking into dinner that evening. "I'm not saying this to embarrass you," I said, softening my tone slightly, though I made sure the core of what I was saying remained clear and unambiguous. "I'm saying it because I want you both to understand what actually happened here. You didn't just make a difficult financial decision under pressure. You decided, without asking, without any real consideration, that my education was the expendable line item in this family's budget, while Michelle's wedding remained completely untouchable. And the truth is, that decision didn't actually hurt me financially in any lasting way because I've built something you didn't even know about. But it told me exactly where I rank in this family's priorities, and that's what I actually can't get past." Michelle spoke up then, her voice smaller than I usually heard it, something genuinely uncertain in her expression for maybe the first time in years. "I didn't know they were pulling money from your tuition for my wedding," she said. "I swear I didn't know that's where the extra money was coming from." "Would you have said something if you had known?" I asked, turning to look at her directly, and I watched her hesitate, clearly caught between the truth and the answer she knew would sound better in the moment. "I don't know," she finally admitted, and I appreciated, at least, that she didn't try to dress up an easy answer for the sake of the room. "Probably not. I really wanted the wedding to be perfect." I nodded slowly, not particularly surprised by the honesty, even if it stung slightly to hear it confirmed so plainly. My mother finally spoke again, her voice unsteady in a way I rarely heard from her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I think we assumed, because you've always handled things so quietly on your own, that this would just be another thing you'd manage without much difficulty. We didn't think about what it actually meant, prioritizing the wedding over your education so completely." "I don't need the tuition money back," I said, and I meant it, though I could see the offer forming on my father's face before I even finished the sentence, some instinct toward correction now that the actual numbers had reframed the entire situation for him. "That's not really what this is about. I've got it handled, and honestly, I'll have the loan paid off within a few months given what I'm bringing in. What I need is for you both to actually sit with what this decision revealed, rather than just fixing it now that you know I make more money than expected." My father was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the papers still in front of him, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the detached, procedural tone from his original email. "I think I owe you a real conversation about this," he said. "Not tonight, maybe, but soon. I want to understand the business you've built. I want to understand why you felt like you couldn't tell us, and I think I need to think harder about some of the assumptions I've been making about fairness in this family." It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping reconciliation some part of me might have wanted in that moment, but it felt honest, felt like the beginning of an actual reckoning rather than another quick, surface-level apology meant to smooth over the discomfort of the evening. Over the following weeks, my father did follow through on that promise, asking me detailed, genuinely curious questions about my consulting work, questions that felt less like polite interest and more like someone recalibrating his understanding of who his daughter actually was outside the narrow role he'd always assigned me within the family. My mother, for her part, made a point of including me more deliberately in conversations going forward, small gestures that felt clumsy at first but genuine underneath the clumsiness. Michelle's wedding happened 3 months later, exactly as extravagantly planned, ice sculpture and live band included, and I attended without resentment, having made my peace with the fact that I'd never fully control how my parents chose to allocate their own money, even if I could control how much power that allocation held over my own sense of worth within the family. What had actually changed, in the end, wasn't the wedding or the tuition or even my parents' spending habits. What changed was quieter and more permanent than that, the understanding, finally shared openly rather than hidden beneath years of modest deflection, that I had built something substantial entirely on my own, and that no decision made at that dinner table, however careless or however deliberate, could actually diminish what I'd already proven myself capable of.